Washington to Moscow, New York to Paris, Rome to Jerusalem. The prophecies of the Bible are being fulfilled. Stand by for J.R. Church and today's Prophecy in the News.
On today's program, we're going to be talking about the Torah design, the divine design of the New Testament. After looking for a couple of weeks at the divine design of Matthew, how that Matthew depicts Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and the life of Christ depicts those 5 books as they are set the framework for this. These 5 books are of Matthew. We found that the entire 5 books of the New Testament, that is the first 5 books, Matthew through the book of Acts, is also designed after the Torah. And we want to share that with you on today's Prophecy in the News. Now, in order to prepare you for this Torah design of the New Testament, let us give some comparisons of the New Testament in general with the Old Testament. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me this divine design of the New Testament.
And J.R., there is so much to say. We'll have to very carefully edit our words here, but to begin with, when you balance the Old and the New Testament against each other, they are both covenants. That is, they have a covenantal relationship between God and man, the Old and the New Covenant, and they are both divided in roughly the same way.
There are, in fact, they represent covenants. Okay? The Old Testament is called an Old Testament, and the New Testament is called a New Testament. So this is the comparison of the two. Then they both have 2 divisions. In the Old Testament, we have the law and the prophets. In the New Testament, we have the Gospels and the epistles.
That's right.
And the themes of each of these also compare. In the Old Testament, we saw 3 menorahs presented, 7 lampstands. In the New Testament, we see 3 menorahs also presented. They are Hanukkah menorahs of 9 lamps each, but they are nevertheless menorahs. 3 in the Old, 3 in the New.
That's right.
And then we notice that the Old Testament corresponds to the Hebrew alphabet. There were once called 22 divisions of these 39 books of the Old Testament. Up until the 3rd century, they were noted as 22 divisions, corresponding to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And we found that the New Testament also corresponds with the framework and the meanings of these Hebrew letters of their alphabet. So, Gary, this is really fascinating to see all of these comparisons between the New Testament and the Old Testament.
It really is, J.R. And the final comparison, the one we want to really sort of camp on today, is the fact that both the Old Testament and the New Testament have 5 foundational books. In the Old Testament, it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. In the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. Those are foundational to each testament.
Yes. And what is so fascinating about these 5 foundational books is that Matthew corresponds to the book of Genesis. And Luke, or Mark, corresponds to Exodus, Luke corresponds to Leviticus, John corresponds to Numbers, and Acts corresponds to Deuteronomy. And we want to share this with you today and show you how these themes correspond. Now, whoever designed this had to really be smart.
Whoever, he says.
Yes.
Well, I wonder who it was. Of course,
it's got to be a divine design.
We hold the view that the Bible is the divine and full inspiration of the Word of God. It comes from His mind.
Yeah. No mere man could have laid out these 5 books in their themes.
That's right.
And the way they are structured to correspond with the structure, the framework, the outlines of those 5 Old Testament books.
That's right.
Genesis through Deuteronomy. So let's begin with Genesis and Matthew. Gary, first of all, Genesis gives us the story of the beginnings.
It does indeed.
So does Matthew, doesn't it?
Absolutely. In Genesis, we have the creation of the earth, and the very first, I guess we could say the crowning achievement of the creation of earth is the creation of man. That is the first Adam. And Adam is given dominion over the planet. In fact, in Genesis 1:29, for example, God said, "Behold, I've given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth, every tree." He goes through a list of things he's given. And in the 30th verse, "And to every beast of the earth, every fowl of the air, everything that creepeth upon the earth." Adam is given dominion, so we could call him a king. Well, in the opening of Matthew, we have the presentation of the second Adam, who comes as king, and he greets his people as King Messiah.
He is the second Adam, and he is the King of Kings. The law, basically, the 5 books, teaches us as a schoolmaster. But these 5 books of the law teach grace, don't they, Gary?
They certainly do. Because it is God who is virtually doing everything in the Torah. Now, Torah is just the Hebrew word law. And in Torah, as expounded by rabbinic commentators, they talk about the behavior and conduct of man, how man should order his life and his footsteps in accordance with God's will. Everything comes across very tightly bound and legalistic. But as we take a look back at Torah, J.R., we see the hand of God working in grace. For example, by grace, he creates man, places him in the garden, and when man falls, by grace, God lifts him up again. And then later on, in the story of Abraham in Genesis, by grace, God gives Abraham a covenant, which is to be an everlasting covenant in perpetuity. It's all by grace. So we can see grace in the Torah.
Yes. So in the 5 books of the law, we have the law, which teaches grace, but in the 5 books of the New Testament, the foundational books, we see grace personified.
That's right.
Now, the most chapters in Genesis revolves around one story. That is the story of Joseph. We have Joseph in the book of Genesis, and we have Jesus, the antitype of Joseph, in the book of Matthew.
J.R., how many times on these broadcasts have we talked about the similarities between the life of Joseph and the life of Christ? It's very common. I think it's not an unfamiliar subject to most Christians. They would realize that Joseph and Jesus conform in typology to each other. But now we're looking at it a slightly different way. Now we're really beginning to compare Genesis with Matthew.
Yes. And the story in Genesis is that Joseph goes down into Egypt and then brings the chosen people for their protection. And Exodus shows they're going back out and heading for the promised land.
That's right.
In Matthew, we have another Joseph and another dream.
Wow. We certainly do.
Listen to Matthew chapter 2 and verse 13. "And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream." And then, of course, he takes the Christ child, the chosen person. Israel is a type of Christ. The chosen people are a type of the chosen person. The promised seed of Israel. It is Israel who produces this child, Jesus. And he is taken into Egypt for his protection. Incredible.
Oh, yes.
And then, correspondence.
Much in the way that the children of Abraham went down into Egypt to escape famine. And in the 14th verse of Matthew 2, we have the story of the young child and his mother leaving by night, departing to Egypt. And the 15th verse of Matthew 2, was there, we have the family of Jesus being in Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, this is the prophet Hosea, saying, "Out of Egypt have I called my son." Now, J.R., that's really got 2 ideas attached to it, hasn't it?
Israel is the firstborn son of God. Exodus chapter 4, verse 22 says, and Jesus is the only begotten Son of God. And so we've got the analogy here, the beauty between the two. And then verse 19 also gives us a dream, doesn't it?
It does. "But when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise and take the young child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel.
Okay, so the comparison of Matthew with Genesis is basically it is the story of the beginnings, one of the first Adam, the other of the second Adam. It is the introduction of Joseph and Egypt, and Matthew, the introduction of the antitype of Joseph, also in Egypt and coming out of Egypt. That brings us then to the book of Exodus and its corresponding New Testament book, the Gospel of Mark. Gary, tell us about it.
Well, it's very interesting, J.R. Exodus and Mark would not at first seem to have much in common. But let's begin first by saying that the tone of both books is similar.
Yes.
The emotional level, there's a sense of urgency both in Exodus and in Mark.
Yeah, beautiful way to put it. Because in Exodus, we have the story of, let my people go, let my people go, let's go. Tonight we eat the Passover lamb, in the morning we go. In the morning it's let's get gone. And then they come to the Red Sea, and the Red Sea parts, and the people cross. And the Egyptians come down into the Red Sea, and they're drowned. And they move on across into, in other words, it's a hurry up and escape the world.
It really is.
And what we have in the Gospel of Mark are words such as, Jesus was driven into the wilderness by the Spirit, where in other books he is led into the wilderness.
Yes.
Mark has this urgency about him. We have over and over and over, Mark says, and immediately this, or and immediately that, or straightway this, and straightway that happens.
That's right.
He has a certain urgency about him.
There's even the word forthwith, like, for example, in 129 of Mark, and forthwith they were come out of the synagogue. And the whole narrative is a rapid-paced journey. Now, interestingly, in Exodus, the theme is redemption out of slavery. And Mark traditionally has been called the book of the servant. That is, it presents Jesus as servant. What's the tie-in there?
Well, Moses was a servant. Jesus was a servant. You remember when, after Moses was dead, God said to Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. So Moses was a servant, and we have here, you remember Moses said, there shall arise unto thee a prophet like unto me, unto him ye shall hearken. And this great prophecy of Moses referred to the future Messiah. And so when Jesus came, they wanted to know, art thou Moses? Art thou that servant, the antitype of Moses? Yes, the Gospel of Mark presents Jesus as the antitype of Moses, the man who brings redemption. Moses brought redemption to a chosen people. Jesus brings redemption to a chosen people as well. We are that chosen people.
Oh,
it's beautiful, isn't it?
It's a beautiful comparison, and I wish we had more time, but in order to make our schedule on this broadcast, we're going to have to move.
Right on to Leviticus, and Leviticus is just absolutely incredible. The book of Leviticus refers to the Levites, that is the priesthood, and their order, and their services, and their sacrifices. It is the temple order. And the Gospel of Luke, corresponding to the book of Leviticus, is the book of the temple. Luke is the book of the temple. The opening chapter of Luke, Gary, shows us Zacharias and his ministering to the temple, in the temple.
Does,
and he comes into the holy place to the golden altar of incense, and Gabriel meets him there to tell him that he's going to have a son named John, who grew up to become John the Baptist. The very next thing we see is Jesus being brought to the temple for his Pidyon Haben ceremony. And at 30 days old, and the pair of turtle doves were brought. And the head of the priesthood, Simeon, the high priest, takes Jesus, the infant, in his arms, and he says, this is the light of the Gentiles and the glory of Israel. So the priesthood and the temple formally recognize the priesthood of the Lord Jesus Christ, if you please.
Oh, yes. And then Jesus, there's the famous incident concerning Jesus coming up to the temple for Passover when he was 12 years old.
Yes, there's his bar mitzvah.
Yes, it
is.
is.
You see, all of these are temple events. It revolves around the Leviticus book of the Old Testament.
And even to the point that we have in the 20th chapter of Luke.
Well, wait a minute.
Oh, okay.
At 12 years of age, let's not forget, after 3 days looking for him, he was found talking to the priesthood.
3 days.
3 days.
Now, you've got to go ahead and elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, it's got to have a reference to the third millennium. In the third millennium, and of course it's been 2,000 years now since Jesus came the first time. We are about to enter the beginning of the third millennium. I think we're going to find Jesus in the temple. He is the great high priest. He's coming to rule and reign over the earth as King of Kings and Lord of Lords during the third day, if you please.
And in Luke, Jesus presents himself as the stone which the builders rejected. He delivers this discourse while he is standing in the temple and having discourses with the priests, scribes, Pharisees, the Levites, have several discourses with him, and he presents himself as the stone which was rejected by the builders.
In chapter 6 of Luke, it says, "And it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first." And over and over and over again, Gary, we have his reference to his teaching in the Sabbath days. For example, in chapter 4 and verse 31, he came down to Capernaum, city of Galilee, and taught them on the Sabbath days. And we get over here to Acts chapters 19 and 20. We have Jesus, for example, in chapter 19, verse 45, he went into the temple, and verse 46 says, verse 47 says, and he taught daily in the temple. And this just shows the comparison of the story here. The basic story is of Jesus and the temple. Jesus and the Levitical priesthood. It's the Leviticus of the New Testament.
And J.R., this we could go on with this for quite a while, but again, in the interest of time, we must move to the next division, and this is a comparison between the book of Numbers, the fourth book of the Old Testament, and the book of John, the fourth book of the New Testament. Now, at first, you say to yourself, what possible comparison could there be between Numbers, which is the wilderness march of Israel, and John, in which Jesus is presented as deity, and yet there is a strong comparison.
Yes. In the book of Numbers, the first 9 chapters talk about numbering the old generation, numbering the people. Everybody 20 years of age and older. The people under 20 years of age do not get numbered in the opening chapters of Numbers.
That's right.
And we see this order. And then in chapters 10 through 25, we see the disorder, all of the rejection and the rebellion.
Right.
And then finally, what chapter is it?
About 26 through 36.
Okay, in chapter 26, we have the reorder. As we have order, disorder, and reorder. And we open this in chapter 26 of the book of Numbers with the numbering of the new generation. Those who were 20 years of age and under, they are now the new generation, the ones who are going to get to enter the promised land.
Wow.
And they are numbered.
You're talking about the new birth, perhaps?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. That's what the Gospel of John's all about here. We have Jesus revealed, and then Jesus rejected, and then Jesus revealed to the new generation.
That's right. And that pattern in John mirrors or reflects the pattern we find in Numbers. Now, interesting comparison. Numbers, the wilderness march, could be called the book of unbelief.
Yeah.
Because of the unbelief of the people.
Right.
But yet the theme in the book of John is believe. Believe that Jesus is who he says he is.
Chapter 20 of John, verse 31.
That's right.
Absolutely. It's beautiful. We've got to read that.
We have to.
Time to read this verse. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name. So you can see the contrast here between John and the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers was a preparation for entry into the promised land. Well, the Gospel of John is also a preparation for an entry into the church age. We see Numbers preparing the people for what they're going to learn in the book of Deuteronomy. We see the Gospel of John preparing us for what we will learn in the book of Acts, which brings us then to those 2 final books of the foundations of each of these covenants, the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, and the New Covenant or the New Testament. Wow. Let's compare Deuteronomy to the book of Acts.
And this one, JR, I think is the easiest comparison of all, because both Deuteronomy and Acts are histories. Acts is a history of the early church. Deuteronomy is a history. And Deuteronomy is divided roughly into three parts. Chapters 1 through 4 of Deuteronomy tell about what God has done for his people. Chapters 5 through 27 roughly talk about what God expects his people to do in response. And the third section, Deuteronomy, chapter 27 through chapter 37,
34?
34,
concluding chapters of
concluding
Deuteronomy.
chapters of Deuteronomy. 27 through 34 talks about what God is going to do for his people.
Yes.
So it's a history and a prophetic overview.
Yeah. And listen to Deuteronomy chapter 4. This begins with teaching the lessons of Sinai to the new generation. And in my Bible here, the heading just above chapter 4, verse 1 says, the new generation taught the lessons of Sinai. Chapter 5 says, the new generation taught the Mosaic covenant. The chapters continue with saying, the new generation is taught this, the new generation is taught that, and so on. So this is the book of Deuteronomy, comparing with the book of Acts. When the church is born and the new generation is given the Holy Spirit and taught the gospel of Jesus Christ.
And what's really interesting to me, and quickly I'm going to find it, Acts 1, chapter 1. Verse 8 is an outline of the entire book of Acts. But ye shall receive power after that the Holy Ghost is come upon you. Ye shall be witnesses unto me both in Jerusalem, and in all Judea and Samaria, and unto the uttermost part of the earth. This is an outline of the book, J.R. Part 1 of Acts talks about the Jerusalem experience. Part 2 of Acts talks about Judea and Samaria. Part 3 of Acts talks about what's going on out to the uttermost parts of the earth.
Yes.
So you have that threefold division, just as you had back in Deuteronomy.
The Jerusalem part of Acts is chapters 1 through 8. The Judea-Samaria part is 8 through 12. And the uttermost parts of the earth section is chapters 13 through 28. Now, when we come down to the conclusion of the book of Deuteronomy, we have the Song of Moses and God saying in chapter 32 and verse 21, they have moved me to jealousy with that which is not God. They have provoked me to anger with their vanities, and I will move them to jealousy with those which are not a people. God says, I'm going to turn to the Gentiles.
Wow.
Well, Gary, we have the same thing in the concluding chapter of the book of Acts.
We do. Acts 28:28. Be it known, therefore, unto you that the salvation of God is sent unto the Gentiles, and that they will hear it. It's
Beautiful.
amazing. And it's such a beautiful point-by-point comparison. And J.R., this has been a lightning-fast trip.
Yes, it has, but time is running out.
Yes, it is.
What we have here, basically, we'll repeat. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts are the 5 foundational books of the New Covenant, or New Testament. The epistles are commentaries of those first 5 books, the Gospels. In the first 5 books of the Old Covenant or Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, we have the 5 foundational books, and the books that follow that are commentaries on those 5 books. We have the Old Testament and the New Testament framed together. One design is like the other, and it could not possibly have been put together by mere man. It had to be divinely designed. We'll be back in just a moment.
This is America's foremost prophetic monthly, Prophecy in the News. You can get a free introductory subscription to Prophecy in the News just by calling this number, 1-800-475-1111. Each month, J.R. Church and the research team give you the news from a prophetic perspective. At least 2 full-length prophetic studies are included in every issue, plus commentaries on important subjects: education, politics, economics, science. Keep up with the events in Europe and the Middle East by ordering your free introductory subscription to Prophecy in the News right now. Just pick up your phone and dial this toll-free number, 1-800-475-1111. Operators are standing by right now to take your call. If the phone is busy, keep trying. You'll get through, and you'll be glad you did. The newspaper is free. The call is free, so what are you waiting for? Here's that toll-free number again, 1-800-475-1111. Ask for the free introductory subscription to Prophecy in the News.
Now we're back. Here is our newspaper, Prophecy in the News. This is the brand new June edition. And the very first article here is on the life of Christ outlined by the Pentateuch. And of course, Pentateuch being the first 5 books of the Bible. This right here is our television program from the last 2 weeks. I think it would be of interest to you to get this newspaper. Also, next week, we're going to be talking about Israel as the firstborn son of God. What happened to Israel when it was 8 days old? Did it receive a circumcision ceremony, the Brit Milah? Yes, it did. What happened to the nation of Israel in 1948 when it was 30 days old? Did it conform to the ceremony of the Pidyon Habin, the redemption of the firstborn? What happened to Israel when it was 30 days old? What about when Israel was 13 years old? Did it have a bar mitzvah? These are absolutely incredible prophetic scenarios that have been played out in the modern history of Israel, and we are going to see that on our next television program. I hope you'll be sure and tune in. I want you to call and get this newspaper. It's free for the next 6 months just by calling us here at 1-800-475-1111. Gary, let's wrap up today's program.
Well, to wrap it up, here's the basic statement we have to make, JR. There is an overall structure to the Bible. The Bible is not just a bunch of loosely connected books. It has a grand design, and God is just now opening it up so that we're able to see it. And this is absolutely a marvelous new thing. You know, we could go on into Romans and compare the next book after Deuteronomy, Joshua.
With Joshua.
Romans and Joshua even compare. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So
it's incredible.
This is startling, and I think our response to it should be that as we go to the Word, from now on, we need to go to it as something even higher and grander than we might have thought it was before.
And you know, Gary, it seems to me that it all started about last November when we began to see this grand design of the Bible. Where will it all end?
I can't wait.
The Bible appears to be so infinite. There's so many little facets to it, like a beautiful diamond, all those different facets. You turn it this way and you see one thing, you turn it this way and you see something else, you turn it this way and it's an entirely different picture. That's what God has done in the layout and the design and the framework of the entire Bible. And one thing that is so important, I think, from this is that we understand that the New Testament is just as divinely designed as the Old Testament. Oh, would to God that the Jewish people could see this. This is J.R. Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.